The stage jolted over the last ridge at dusk, and Mercy Calloway pressed her gloved fingers to the window glass as if touch alone might steady the world. Smoke drifted in the valley like a gray veil. It took her a breath, too, before she understood it wasn't campfire smoke or a rancher's burn pile. The column rose from where a letter had promised a whitewashed house, a neat fence, a red-handled pump, and a man she'd never met who called himself Owen Talbot and signed his name with a confident flourish that had made her heart feel steadier in the night. The driver shouted to the horses. The coach lurched. Mercy braced herself and swallowed the metallic taste of disappointment before it could bloom into panic. The closer they came, the more the smoke simplified the scene into stark shapes. Black ribs of timbers, a chimney standing like a gravestone, a scatter of sparks that found the evening wind and drifted away. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow I have a special story for you. The stage rolled to a grinding stop. No welcome lantern swung from a porch. No boots thudded off a front step to lift her trunk. Where a home had been promised, fire had fed and finished. The last of the flames clung to a rafter and then let go, hissing into a patch of wet earth, leaving behind only the restless whisper of cooling ash. Mercy didn't move when the driver climbed down and swore softly. She didn't move when he opened the door and held out his hand with the gentleness of a man who'd seen strangers meet bad news before. She moved when she was ready, because it was her name on the letter, her life wrapped up in a trunk and a folded document secreted in a stitched hem, her breath that had carried a dozen whispered prayers over 1,000 miles of dust and track. Her boots sank an inch into blackened mud at the edge of the yard. The posts were blistered. The pump lay on its side, handle twisted. The chimney leaned as if listening for a sound it knew would never come again. No bodies, no stretcher tracks, just ruin. Owen Talbot's last letter, creased, recreased, and read so often the paper had softened like cloth, had spoken of a cottonwood tree and a stovepipe he thought was a little crooked but serviceable as an old preacher. The cottonwood remained, leaves shivering with evening wind, its bark blackened on one side. The stovepipe lay half buried in ash, bent into a question mark. "Miss?" the driver ventured. He kept his distance the way frontiermen did when grief might swing wide. "You sure this is your stop?" "My name is Mercy Calloway." She said it clearly. There was dignity in naming yourself when the world tried to smudge out your edges. "This is where Owen Talbot wrote me to come." He slid his hat back, frowned at the desolation, and looked toward the eastern track that led to town. "Hollow Rock's 5 miles. Sheriff will know something. Blacksmith, too. Town sleeps early, but not that early. You want me to haul you on?" Mercy knelt and pressed her palm to the earth near the stepstones, testing warmth. Ash printed her glove like gray flour. "Was anyone here?" she asked the ground before she asked the driver. A ridiculous habit, asking the quiet earth first, but the quiet had answered her more often than people had. Could be today, could be this afternoon, could be yesterday. His eyes flicked toward the cottonwood and away again. "I didn't see no smoke on my morning leg." The wind shifted, bringing the smell of wet char and something sweet beneath it, scorched flour or sugared coffee that had boiled over. Mercy's stomach pinched. She straightened, dusted ash from her skirt, and set her jaw into the shape of a plan even though the plan hadn't arrived yet. "Put my trunk down there," she said, pointing to a patch of bare earth outside the worst of the wreckage, not in the ash. He obeyed, relieved to have something useful to do. The trunk was battered, the brass corners bright where hands had worried them. Mercy's hand glided over the lid and paused at the hairline seam no one noticed unless they knew to look. A narrow strip of fabric doubled and quilted into the underside, a work of needle and stubbornness, hiding a packet of bank drafts and bearer coupons that represented a future no one here would credit to a mail-order bride with plain dresses and careful eyes. She straightened. "I'll go to Hollow Rock." "You want I should wait?" the driver asked. "Road's dicey after dark. Folks say the Briggs boys ride it for sport when the moon's right." Mercy thought of the letters in her carpetbag, Owen's tidy script, the shape of hope poured into sentences. If he had run, or been run off, or died. She flattened her palm against her skirt to steady the tremor that wanted to start. "No," she said. "I've asked enough of your team for one day. I'll manage from here." He hesitated. "Ma'am, I'll manage," she repeated. There was no anger in it, only decision. He tipped his hat, lifted himself to the box, and started the team. The stage rattled away, leaving Mercy alone with ash, silence, and a cottonwood whose leaves couldn't stop their nervous conversation. She let herself look, really look. The pattern of burn told its own story, hotter near the kitchen corner, where the roof had fallen through and the stove lay on its face. Shallower at the parlor edge, where a framed rectangle of wall still held a ghost of color where a picture had hung. The path through the yard showed fresh boot marks overlaying older ones. The fresh were wide, heel-heavy, towing outward, men who'd stood and watched, or men who'd kicked through debris to be sure nothing of value had out-stubborned to the flames. She stepped to the chimney and touched brick, still warm in the core. The ash nearest the hearth was laced with pale grit where mortar had failed. Beneath the grit lay a darker stripe, too regular to be accident. She crouched, slid her fingers through ash until they struck iron. A hinge. The hearth had a trap, small, neat, the kind of hiding place a man with secrets might trade for peace of mind. Mercy brushed ash away until a square of iron showed itself. She set her fingers beneath the lip and pulled. It refused. She tried again, teeth clenched. The third tug granted a grudging inch before catching on a warped edge. "Stubborn old thing," she murmured, and would have laughed if the sound wouldn't have snapped what was left of her composure. She had always respected stubbornness in objects. It meant they'd lasted long enough to be contrary. Bootsteps approached on the road. The sound was unhurried, weight steady, the stride of a man who didn't apologize for taking up space. Mercy wiped ash across her skirt without meaning to, and rose, keeping the trap between her and the road without making it look like she was keeping anything at all. He came into view around the cottonwood, tall enough to cast a shadow that reached her even with the day's last light low. A leather apron hung from his shoulder, folded and tied off at his waist. His left sleeve was pinned up above the elbow, clean and blunt. His right hand carried a pair of tongs, as if he'd forgotten he held them. "Evening," he said. His voice was shaped like iron cooled too fast, rough at the edges, but honest. "I'm Gideon Rook, Smith down in Hollow Rock." Mercy watched his eyes. Men let their eyes tell on them in the first half-minute. His didn't slide over her trunk or her carpetbag. They took in the burned house, the stubborn hinge, the ash on her gloves. They held. "I'm Mercy Calloway. I was meant to marry a man who lived here." He nodded once, as if that fit with whatever he'd prepared to hear. "Saw the smoke from the forge. Sheriff's out on the North Ridge checking a fence cut. I came because fire leaves nails that cut horses and children." He lifted the tongs, embarrassed by his own kind of poetry. "And because folks shouldn't stand alone in the ash." The words loosened something in her chest that had been wound tight since the stage first dipped into the valley. She gestured toward the hearth. "There's a trap here." Gideon knelt without ceremony, not minding the ash that took to his knee. He slid the tongs beneath the warped lip. Where a two-handed man might have relied on brute force, he relied on angle, leverage, patience. The lid creaked, shifted, and then lifted a full hand's width, full. Heat breathed out. Old heat, banked and resentful. He set the lid aside with care. Inside the cavity lay things the fire had not entirely claimed. A tin box, charred around the edges, a shot glass fused to its own melt, a leather pouch burned through to show coins like fish scales. Mercy reached for the tin. Gideon's tongs beat her hand there and hooked the box heft with the practice of a man who refused to let heat decide his day for him. He set it on an unburned stepstone and nodded. "Give it a minute," he said. They waited together. The wind trafficked a handful of sparks upward and went quiet. A night bird called once. Mercy opened the tin when the metal no longer threatened to brand her. Inside lay a folded paper, warped by water and heat, edges charred into black lace. She teased it open along the unburned middle. The words swam at first and then resolved. A diagram traced in pencil, a surveyor's sketch of a rectangle with a stream curled along its edge and a notation that said water right, prior appropriation, and a date. Below it in Owen Talbot's tidy script, the same hand that had bid her come west, a line. "If anything happens, the creek makes the land worth the fight. Don't let Briggs scare you." The name lay on the page like a challenge. "Briggs," Gideon said, reading what her eyes let slip. He pronounced it like a sore tooth a man learns around. "Ransom Briggs owns the South Spread, owns the law when it's thin, owns trouble any time of day he's thirsty." "I'm not giving him the creek." The steadiness of Mercy's own voice surprised her. Gideon's mouth quirked without becoming a smile. "Good you said it out loud makes it real." He lifted the tin's bottom layer with the tongs. Beneath the survey lay a small brass key and a scrap of oilcloth wrapped around a strip of paper stamped First National Bank of Hollow Rock. Mercy nested the items into her palm. The paper was a claim ticket, box number, date, a signature that could have been Owen's or anyone who practiced Owen's hand. "The bank," Mercy said. "He left something there." "Bank's closed after 5, Gideon said, "and Fitch locks it like it holds his soul. Mrs. Peabody keeps a boarding house on Mill Street. Decent stew if you get there early, clean sheets. You can see the bank from her stoop, and it's a comfort to see what you mean to do in the morning." Mercy looked at the ruin that had been her destination. "I don't want to leave it." Gideon nodded. "You don't have to want to. You only have to decide what keeps you safe enough to come back." He looked down at the ash, then at her trunk. "I'll carry that for you." "You need both hands for a trunk," Mercy said before she could swallow the foolishness of it. Then she bit her lip. "Forgive me. You meant what most folks mean," Gideon said, not unkindly. "And you're right. I'll borrow a boy with 2 good arms and the rest of him still growing." "Sam!" Gideon called toward the cottonwood, and a shadow unlatched itself from the tree, thin, quick, and eager to please. Sam squinted into the waning light. "You hollered, Mr. Rook?" "Get that trunk. Mind your back. Mind Miss Calloway's eyes." Sam flushed and grabbed the handles. Mercy would have argued, would have tried to lift it herself as she lifted everything else alone, but Sam's face made argument unkind. They set off together as the valley deepened toward night, the cottonwood leaves shaking off ash, the ridge darkening like a lid closing. Mercy glanced back one last time and fixed the ruin in her mind, not to trap herself in grief, but to honor the house by noticing. A woman who came from nothing else had learned to give names to the pieces of her own life and to keep them safe by remembering them. Hollow Rock caught light in its windows one by one as they entered. The general store's lamp already turned down to save wick. The saloon's windows letting out fiddle music, a slippery tune that pretended to be happier than it was. The doctor's kerosene burning steady, and the bank, a square-shouldered building with shutters tight. On Mill Street, the boarding house's signs swung on squeaky hooks. Peabody Rooms, stew at 7, pie if God wills. Mrs. Peabody was as broad as the doorway and twice as warm when she wanted to be. She took in Mercy's ash-smeared gloves and the trunk's battered corners, then looked over Gideon's shoulder at the man himself and softened at the edges. Gideon Rook.
You still walking around making yourself useful after dark? Come in, child, she said to Mercy. You're late, but there's still left if you aren't precious about carrots boiled to surrender. Mercy managed to thank you without letting her voice wobble. She chose a seat near the wall where she could see both the door and the stairs. The habit wasn't new. It had been her habit in boarding houses 2,000 miles east where men drank away a week's wage and looked for an apology they never deserved. Gideon didn't linger, which made Mercy like him better than if he had. He inclined his head toward her bowl, toward the stairs, toward the idea of sleep, and said, Bank opens at 8. I'll be at the forge by dawn if you need a place to stand where people let you stand. Then he left with the same unhurried stride with which he had arrived.
Mrs. Peabody set stew in front of Mercy and a slice of pie beside it, whether God willed or not. That one is the best sort, she said, nodding toward the door Gideon had taken. People act different around a man who can do in one hand what most can't manage with two. Makes them kinder sometimes, or meaner. Depends what they were to begin with. Mercy ate because strength required fuel. Between spoonfuls she asked, How long has Mr. Rook been here? Mrs. Peabody folded a towel with ritual precision. Since before the flood that took the low bridge. Since the winter the fever took my husband. Since Briggs shook the mayor's hand and called it a bargain. Long enough to wear grooves into the town with his walking. She lowered her voice, unnecessary but satisfying. Long enough to know where bodies are buried, if we buried any. We haven't, she added quickly, crossing herself and then smoothing the gesture away, as if it were untidy to believe too hard. Mercy chewed, swallowed, and dared the next question. Do you know the name Owen Talbot? Mrs. Peabody's mouth tightened. He came through, sat where you sit, though he didn't sit easy. Soft-spoken, not foolish. He had a careful way with words, like he'd counted them and didn't want to owe anybody. He collected letters. From whom? Mercy asked, though the answer went iron cold in her stomach before she finished the question. Mrs. Peabody looked at Mercy's hands, at the plain ring she wore, the ring she had bought herself at a pawn counter 3 towns back, a promise to her own heart that she could be worth marrying. From women back east, she said gently. From you, I suppose. He wrote me, Mercy said. She steadied her voice. We had an agreement. People have those, Mrs. Peabody said. Hollow Rock likes to turn agreements into meals. Some men hold up their end, some men hold up the whole table and expect applause. She sighed. He posted a notice for a wife. I told him if he was bargaining for a soul, he ought to pay full price. Was he good? Mercy asked, hating the childlike tremor that hung on the last word. Mrs. Peabody considered. He was not cruel. He kept out of Briggs's way, which is a sort of goodness born of fear. He paid for his stew and never threw the bowl. She patted Mercy's shoulder in a way that could break you if you needed to break. I don't know what he is now. I saw smoke this afternoon. Gideon saw it first. Sheriff Kells is a decent man, but the law hangs loose on this county. If Briggs wants your creek, he'll try to pocket the whole valley and call it legal. Mercy tasted ash again between bites of stew. Owen left a claim ticket for a bank box. Mrs. Peabody's eyes sharpened. Then your morning will be interesting. She set a key on the table, the key to the boarding house room, and wrapped Mercy's fingers around it. Sleep if sleep comes. If it doesn't, lie flat and think of a wall that doesn't move. Sleep came for Mercy when it had no more excuses. It came late, arranging itself in thin layers. She dreamt of hinges. She woke early enough to taste the forge's smoke in the street when she stepped into the dawn. The town was making its first noises, brooms on stoops, a horse stamping against the idea of harness, a bucket knocked over somewhere. The bank's shutter stood like the tight mouth of a stingy uncle. Mercy waited with her palms folded and her throat dry. She had walked into more than rooms and towns. She had walked into a game played by men who carried rules inside their pockets and changed them when it suited. Elroy Fitch opened the bank with a key on a string around his neck. He had a face like a ledger, neat columns, sharp corners, a little red ink in the eyes. He glanced at Mercy and arranged his mouth into a smile that showed mostly teeth. "Good morning," he said, First National Bank of Hollow Rock welcomes depositors of good character and excellent references. Mercy offered neither, only the claim ticket. He took it with thumb and forefinger as if paper carried disease and stepped into the back, where boxes lived behind iron mesh like well-behaved prisoners. The chain on his neck clinked against the counter. He returned with a small steel box and set it on the counter between them. "Sign for your contents," he said, sliding a pen toward her, then cocked his head. "Miss Calloway." She signed with a hand that didn't shake. Mercy Calloway. "Apt," he said, and meant to be charming. He drew the pen back quickly, as if ink were expensive and women were more so. "Shall I give you privacy?" "No," she said. It was a town where privacy made men curious. "I'm content to open it here." Fitch's mouth did a little disappointed turn. He rested his fingers on the counter, a pose of idle interest. Gideon Rook drifted into the doorway at Mercy's back like a shadow that had found its person and refused to be shaken off. He said nothing and didn't need to.
Mercy turned the key and lifted the lid. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine. She slid it free and set the empty box aside. The twine gave under her fingernail. The cloth opened to reveal a neat stack of folded papers and a small, heavy pouch whose weight sang a song she recognized without hearing the notes. Coin. On top lay a letter addressed in Owen Talbot's hand. "If you are reading this, I failed," it began. Mercy read it twice, feeling each sentence like a step on uncertain ground. Owen had known he was a target. He had learned the value of the creek and the malice of a man who measured his ranch by how far his anger could travel. Owen had paid fees, filed papers, and found a way to keep his claim quiet enough to bring a wife without putting a price on her head. "I'm not brave," he'd written. "I'm only tired of running. If I couldn't bring you home to a house, forgive me. Bring the house to the creek." He named 3 men who could be trusted and 1 who could not. The not trusted name repeated. Ransom Briggs. Beneath the letter were 2 deeds, 1 filed, stamped, 1 unfiled but ready for a wife. The filed deed carried the county recorder's mark. The unfiled bore space for a wife's signature beside the husband's. Mercy traced the blank with her thumb, as if her skin would leave a memory there. The pouch contained $20 bold, heavy, old, mint, honest. Not enough to buy a piece. Enough to hire men who wanted to work more than they wanted to lick Briggs's boots. Fitch cleared his throat when Mercy closed the lid. "For your safety," he said, "we offer a storage service at a reasonable rate." He smiled again, this time at Gideon. "And for your protection, we arrange introductions to advocates." "Lawyers?" Mercy asked. "More flexible than lawyers," Fitch said, with a smirk that made Mercy miss the Esch's blunt honesty. "Men who persuade. I won't be needing persuasion, only ink and quiet." Fitch didn't like that answer, though he was too well trained to say so. "If you insist," he said. He rolled up on his toes and back again as if his shoes had opinions. "You'll find the courthouse at the far end of Maine. Recorder sits mornings." Mercy slid the letter back into the oilcloth with the deeds and the coins. She would not leave gold with a man who smiled like that. She took the weight into her bag and felt steadier for it. Outside the bank, light had clarified into morning. Gideon walked at Mercy's shoulder as if he had always done so. "You'll make enemies," he said, almost conversational. "I assume I already have them. I would like to make them honest." Gideon's not quite smile flickered again. Honest enemies are easier to plan for. They made the courthouse by 8:30. The recorder was a woman with spectacles and a quill stained to the second knuckle. She took Mercy's papers, read them with care, and asked questions like a person who had once been burned by dreaming too quickly. Mercy answered straight.
The recorder stamped what could be stamped and told Mercy to keep the rest too close for comfort. Briggs reads filings like a vulture reads heat currents. He'll circle when he sees this. Will the law keep him at altitude? Gideon asked. The law will try. The sheriff will try harder. Briggs counts on trying being different than stopping. The recorder pushed the deed toward Mercy and slid a pen across the counter. Sign it if you are set on being set. Mercy signed. It was a common gesture, a practiced motion. It still felt like a bell rung with her whole hand. They stepped out into a street that had acquired a new shape because Mercy had acquired a new position in it. New shapes attract attention. Heads turned. A boy she didn't know whispered her name to another boy who spelled it wrong and then corrected himself. A woman with a basket of laundry gave Mercy a look that contained pity and a warning, and then flicked her eyes toward the south road where dust rose like a promise. Ransom Briggs arrived on a sorrel horse too fine for the man's seat. He rode with the entitled slouch of money that thinks it has made itself. He had a jaw that chewed opinions and a mustache that had been trained to threaten. Two sons flanked him. Simeon, heavy-boned and already thick where drink settled, and Clay, lean and mean in the way of men who are tired of being second at everything inside their own house. "Morning," Briggs said to no one in particular and everyone at once. His eyes found Mercy and did not move. "You must be the new widow." "I'm not a widow," Mercy said. "Not yet," Clay muttered, and Simeon's laughter made the remark worse. Gideon shifted half a step, not as a challenge, but as a line someone else might be wise not to cross. Briggs considered the blacksmith as if he were a tool on the wall that might be useful or might be in the way. "Rook, you forging for strays now?" "I forge for whoever pays my rate and treats my fire right," Gideon said, not bothering to make the words pretty. Briggs slid his gaze back to Mercy. "You filed papers," he said, as if surprised she'd learned to hold a pen. "I filed what is mine. I intend to live where my husband wrote me to live." "Your husband's dead," Briggs said lazily.
"His letter wasn't," Mercy replied. She did not ask how Briggs knew or why he claimed to. She would not feed his story with her questions. Briggs smiled the way men smile when they've set a trap and the rabbit has walked into it politely. "There's a thing about houses burned to ash," he said. "Homestead law cares for improvements. Improvements go up in smoke, the claim ain't improved. Any man can come along and save the land from neglect. A neighbor could. A generous neighbor might decide to rest cattle along a creek to keep it from sorrow." "You mean theft," Mercy said. Briggs feigned concern. "Big word, not always useful. This country educates men by fire. You're new. You'll learn." He leaned from the saddle and spoke as if confiding a recipe. "The creek's mine. It was always going to be. Talbot didn't understand the math." Mercy did math differently than men like Briggs. She counted cost in nights slept without fear. She counted measurements in what a woman could carry alone. She calculated risks in the watchful eyes of children who learned more from how you stood than what you said. "You can bring every arithmetic you own," she said. "I'll bring mine." Simeon's face went red like a stove left stoked. Clay laughed without humor. Briggs's hands stroked his horse's neck, a gesture that looked gentle if you didn't know how men trained animals to accept pain. "We'll speak again," he said, which meant he planned to speak first and last and do what he wanted in between. He wheeled his horse. Dust rose and settled. The three men headed south in a triangle that fitted the road like a wedge. Gideon watched them go, and then let his breath out slow. "He means to move cattle onto your place before you put the first nail in," he said. Mercy folded Owen's letter in her mind and tucked it behind her ribs where she kept things safe. "Then we put the first nail in before the cattle can find it, and the second after that. Work crews will take coin, and coin buys trouble if you hand it in the street. You have a plan? Yes. Mercy looked down at her hands, at the ash still ground into the seams of the gloves. I keep my head down in public. I hire in 2s and 3s from men you trust. I pay fair and on time. I sleep with the door has 2 locks, and I stay out of the saloon unless there's no other light with house. Gideon considered. Good plan, he said. It's better with a forge attached. I can't pay for a guard, Mercy said, interpreting what he didn't quite say. I didn't offer to be one. He held up his right hand, the tongs biting his palm with their familiar line. I offered a forge, nails, a door bar, hinges that don't argue with you on a cold morning. You bring me iron, I'll turn it into the shapes you need. That's a fair trade. Mercy nodded. I'll bring the iron. They started that afternoon. Mrs. Peabody's Sam wanted to earn coin that jingled, not the kind that clinked. Gideon's apprentice, a Lithuanian boy everyone called Mikas because they couldn't say his full name without swallowing their own tongues, could lift twice his size with a grin that made the work lighter. 2 men from the North Ridge came with a wagon because Gideon had fixed their plow last spring when the share snapped and the corn needed planting. Mercy arranged wages in envelopes and handed them out fast and private. She kept her carpet bag close enough to kick and her eyes on the horizon in a steady sweep. At the homestead, they cleared ash to lines. Mercy set stakes with a string that made sense to her. The house returned to square, the pump set upright with a new pin, the path scraped back to hardpan. She found a jar of buttons fused at the bottom to the shelf where they'd lived. She found a spoon with the handle still bright. She set both on a rock, as if the little altar could persuade the place to remember it had once held breakfasts and mended shirts. Gideon set up a field anvil on a stump and banged shape into need. The sound carried, warning and promise. He worked with a rhythm Mercy respected. Heat, move, test, correct. Where another man might have used left and right, he used shoulder and knee, leveraging, pinning iron under the weight of his calm. When Mikas swung the sledge on Gideon's nod, his strike came true more often than not. When it did not, Gideon never flinched from correction spoken in a tone that taught without belittling. By evening, the new doorframe stood. It had no door yet, but it had intent. The cottonwood, soot-streaked and stubborn, lifted its leaves like an exhausted choir. Sheriff Kells rode in at dusk, hat in hand. He had the kind of tired kindness that came from showing up even when it wouldn't save a man's pride. "Miss Galloway," he said, "I heard what you'd done. I'm sorry for the shape you found it in." "Do you know where Owen Talbot is?" Mercy asked. Kells took that question like a man who had braced for it and still felt the hit. "No." He looked at the ground. "I know where he ain't. He ain't in the jail, and he ain't at the undertaker. That leaves too many places." "He named you as a man to trust," Mercy said, "in his letter." Kels's mouth went soft. "Then I'll earn it." He nodded toward the south. "Briggs is chewing nails. He'll spit 'em where they do harm." Mercy squared herself toward the cottonwood in the dark coming on. "And we'll hammer faster." Kells studied her for a long breath. "You remind me of my sister," he said. "She came out in a creaking wagon with more nerve than sense. She learned fast." He put a folded paper in Mercy's hand. "I wrote an order. It says any cattle on this parcel before your dwelling is rebuilt are trespass. Law enough to wave in a man's face, even if he spits at it. It buys you a day, maybe 2. "A day is a wall you can see from the road," Mercy said. "Thank you." He tipped his hat and left them to their making. That night, Gideon walked Mercy and Sam and Mikas back to town. Hollow Rock's lamps made puddles against the dark. The saloon's music had gone ragged. At the forge, Gideon raked coals into a safer bank and let the anvil's last heat breathe out. At Mrs. Peabody's stoop, Mercy paused. She had learned to ask for what she needed, once, long ago, and not apologize more than twice for the asking. "Would you... tomorrow?" Her throat tightened, betraying more fear than she meant to show. "Will you be there?"
Gideon didn't make her finish the sentence. At first light, he said, with hinges. She slept, the kind of sleep that comes after deciding, not after victory. She woke to the smell of bread and the sound of hooves. On the street below, a rider delivered a note to Mrs. Peabody and then kicked away fast. Mrs. Peabody climbed the stairs slower than her usual, with a folded paper pinched in her fingers. She knocked once and entered without waiting. "This was tacked on the cottonwood," she said. "Sam brought it before Chef Kells could see." She handed Mercy the note. It was written in a tidy hand someone had hired to look official. "Notice of helpful custody," it read. "In light of recent tragedy and the urgent need to steward water for the common good, the undersigned will take temporary control of creek and adjacent lands to prevent neglect, contamination, and further hazard. All decent folk are urged to assist." There was a line for a signature. It bore Ransom Briggs's name, and beneath it the mayor's scrawl like a tear. Mercy felt the hinge again under her fingers, iron and stubborn. "Temporary," she said, "just long enough to forget to return it." Mrs. Peabody snorted. "Briggs calls theft by every other name first." Mercy folded the notice and unfolded it, measuring how fear tried to creep into the seams of her mourning and how she would not let it. "We'll be there before he is," she said, "with a door." They were. Before the sun found the high line of the ridge, Gideon had his field hearth breathing again. Meekus pumped bellows. Sam hauled boards with the proud, awkward grace of a boy who wanted to be a man if only muscles would hurry. Mercy set nails by size in a tin lid and held board ends while Gideon set hinges. By mid-morning, a frame had become a box that could be called a house if you were generous and in love with the idea. A door hung. It didn't fit perfect, but it swung and latched with a sound that made Mercy's throat catch. Gideon heard the catch and pretended he didn't. He stepped back, wiped the sweat line from his brow with the back of his wrist, and regarded the door like it had arguments to make, and he meant to win them. "It'll swell in a storm. I cut the leaves fat to give you forgiveness." "Forgiveness is good carpentry," Mercy said, and surprised herself into a smile that felt like a new thing made with old tools. The Briggs men arrived at noon with 6 hands and a roll of wire. Simeon carried a post maul on his shoulder like a dare. Clay roped in a lazy loop that could be quick if quick paid dividends. Ransom Briggs tipped his hat to Mercy's door as if it had told a joke of which he disapproved. "Well, you put up a lid. Shame if it blows off in a south wind."
"It latches," Mercy said. She held the sheriff's order in her other hand. She did not wave it. The law was more dignified when it kept its chin level. "Your cattle will stay on your ground." Briggs smiled at Gideon. "You make hinges faster than I make fences." "I make hinges at the pace iron admits," Gideon said. "Fences are a man's confession of what he can't hold with his hands." Clay's rope twitched. "You callin' my father weak?" "I'm callin' iron honest," Gideon said. "Can you say that of your notice?" Briggs's smile didn't dim. He gestured, and 2 hands turned their horses toward the creek with the slow confidence of a man who assumes his orders are the weather. Gideon moved without hurry to stand in the path. He didn't rest his weight like a fighter. He set it like a wall. "Don't," he said. Clay laughed. "What if we do?" "Then you'll need a new front tooth," Gideon said mildly. "I can forge you one. Won't chew worth your mother's prayers." Simeon swung the maul down from his shoulder and took 2 steps he thought were a charge. Gideon didn't step back. He stepped forward into the arc, close enough that the maul's head had no speed and Simeon had no balance. Gideon's shoulder, one-armed men learned the leverage of their bodies like a map, met Simeon's sternum and politely asked it to reconsider standing. Simeon folded around the question and hit the ground with a grunt that earned a glance of disgust from his father. "Enough," Briggs said, and his voice carried a new thread, not respect, but the acknowledgement of a force he'd rather not break his boot on today. "We'll be neighborly. We'll visit another time." He took off his hat to waggle it like a gentleman and managed to look like a man swatting flies. "Enjoy your door, Miss Calloway. Doors are promises. Men remember the promises they can break. They retreated without turning their backs, which was wisdom learned from animals. Dust drifted. Silence returned. Mercy's knees were suddenly aware of their own existence. She sat on the step and felt the universe vibrate at a frequency she recognized from the second before a storm or a confession. "Thank you," she said to Gideon. He took the thanks and set them down like something that would keep just fine until later. "Tomorrow the beams. Day after, a roof that'll take a hailstone without accusing you of a sin. You'll need more iron." "I'll sell buttons," Mercy said dryly, thinking of the fused jar and the buttons bright where flame had licked. Then she reached into her bag, measured the weight of the oilcloth pack, and made her second decision of the day. "No," I corrected myself quietly. "I'll use what was left for me to use." They worked until the light told the truth about the hour. When the hammering stopped, the valley breathed. Sam fell asleep on a pile of boards with a crescent of bread in his hand. Mika's fretted over a hinge that sassed him by a degree and finally coaxed it into good behavior with a tap that sounded like apology. Mercy gathered the day's papers and tucked them into the pocket she had sewn against her thigh for just that purpose. The stitched hem in her trunk had kept coins safe across states. The pocket would keep paper close under threat a man had no business putting there. Gideon banked the field hearth. "I'll walk you," he said. It wasn't a question. They had taken 3 steps toward the road when something in the ash shifted. Sound travels differently across ruin. A foot on char makes a whisper distinct from a foot on dirt. Gideon turned his head the way animals do, ears before eyes. Mercy followed his gaze and saw the glint before she understood it. Not a flame, but a sliver of metal catching last light where the hearth had been until now. Gideon stepped back, set his tongs, and knelt at the edge. He brushed ash aside with the sort of care men reserve for a sleeping child or a lit fuse. The glint grew into a corner of a small iron strongbox the first digging had missed, wedged under mortared brick where heat had kept hands away until now. Mercy's breath shortened for reasons that had nothing to do with smoke. "Careful," she said, and hated that the word made her sound like she thought Gideon did anything else. He wedged, lifted, and cursed softly when the box chose to argue. Mika slid in wordlessly with a pry bar, and together they persuaded iron to share what it had eaten. The strongbox was warm, but touchable. It had a lock that insisted on its importance. Gideon looked at Mercy. "Key?"
She almost laughed. Wouldn't that be a mercy? She fished in her bag and found the brass key from the tin. The teeth matched the lock's idea of itself, by luck or by a forethought she chose to call providence. The key turned, the lid lifted. Inside lay a ledger wrapped in canvas, the binding eaten at the corners by damp, a coil of blue ribbon tied around a packet of receipts, a folded paper printed with the masthead of the Red Mesa Land and Water Company. Mercy's stomach went cold and then steadied. The company had been whispering boarding houses up the line, men in clean coats who filed the kind of papers that moved rivers on maps and called it progress. Gideon's jaw set. "Briggs's cousins," he said, or worse. Mercy turned pages. The ledger listed shipments, names, sums. It named a payment to the mayor for something called facilitation, which was a softer word for a blunt thing. It named a payment to Ransom Briggs, small at first, then larger, for access. It named a line Mercy read 3 times before the meaning held. Talbot fire, compensation due upon vacancy. Her hand went still on the page. She felt nothing for a full beat, the body's trick for surviving what the mind understands too quickly. Then heat rose behind her eyes, clean as forge flame. Gideon's voice stayed low. "If that book sees daylight, men will try to put it back in the dark or lose their jobs trying." "I'll make them try in public," Mercy said, "with witnesses." "You'll need more than a door," Gideon said. "I'll need neighbors," she said, and was surprised to feel certainty where fear had sat. They put the ledger back into the box and the box into Mercy's bag, because her body was the safest vault in a county where metal answered to men whose names showed up in its pages. They turned toward the road. 3 riders waited at the cottonwood shadow, quiet as knives. The near one tipped his hat without warmth. "Evening." Mercy tasted grit. Gideon lifted his chin. "You're early for trouble," he said. "We're never early," the rider said, which meant they were ahead of someone else's plan. He shifted in his saddle and the tree leaves shivered, a language Mercy didn't yet speak. "Mr. Briggs wants a word. Said to bring you polite." "Then he should have come himself," Mercy said, and the rider's mouth turned sideways in an expression that wasn't a smile. Gideon angled himself to put his shoulder between the men and Mercy without making the geometry obvious. The lead rider saw it and recognized the math. "We don't need the blacksmith. We only need the lady. You need to learn the meaning of need and the difference between want and can." "Gentlefolk," the rider drawled. "No cause for heat." His hand loosened on his reins and tightened on the pistol he thought he had time to draw. "We'll take our leave with our charge," and Gideon moved first, not fast, but through the only space the rider had not considered. He closed on the horse's head and planted his feet. The animal decided to back up because Gideon told it to, without using words. The rider swore. Another hand lifted a rifle. Mercy's throat went dry and cleared again. She felt for the weight of the coat Miss Peabody kept under her front counter and had briefly beguiled into her bag that morning with more apologies than the theft deserved. Her palm found the grip, the shape fit. "Don't," she said, and didn't recognize her own voice. "There are orders against your cattle. There will be orders against your hands." "Paper," the rider spit toward the road. "We brought fire." He threw. A small bottle arced and shattered where ash still remembered heat. Flame bloomed greedily, hungry for breath. Mika shouted. Sam stumbled backward and nearly fell. Gideon swore and kicked dirt. Mercy's heart jumped and landed in her mouth and kept beating because it had work left. The rider leveled his pistol. "Last chance," he said, and meant to savor it. Mercy lifted the Colt. She had fired at tin cans in the yard behind Miss Peabody's once, because a woman needed to know how anything could feel that could alter her life in a second. The memory was not comfort. It was equipment. She sighted down the barrel into the space right above the rider's belt buckle, because aim for the largest truth when you are frightened. She steadied her breath the way she had steadied her stitching in the lamplight when her fingers had threatened to lie. "Then you'll need to aim higher," she said, not loudly, but without tremor, "because I'm not leaving this land." The rider's mouth made a different promise than his words. He tightened his finger on the trigger. The first shot split the night.
It cracked the valley open like ice under a heel, and Mercy felt the sound in her teeth as much as in her ears. The rider's pistol bloomed smoke. His horse flinched. Her own Colt bucked in her hands a heartbeat later. The sight picture she'd held, belt buckle, breath, belief, snapped, and the bullet took the man's hat rim clean, sending it spinning into the ash like a dark plate. He jerked back in surprise and not bravery. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. Fire licked at the bottle's splash where it had shattered near the old hearth. Mikas threw sand with a desperation that had its own rhythm. Sam, wide-eyed and too young to understand the math of courage, stamped out tongues of flame with his boots as if each were a snake he knew by name. "Back your horses," Gideon said, voice iron calm, right hand easy on the rein he'd caught from the lead gelding when the first shot startled it. "You don't want to be where your animal decides to put you." The lead rider swore and swung his pistol back toward Mercy. angry that his hat had been punished for his mouth. Mercy recited in the space between his wrist and the gun's bite. "Don't miss," her mind said, not as a plea but as a clear instruction, the way she told her hand where to set a stitch. She squeezed, not yanked, and the Colt spoke again. Metal rang. The rider's pistol jumped sideways as if offended. He cried out and shook his hand. The second rider raised a rifle and found Gideon in his bead. Gideon didn't look at the muzzle. He looked at the rider's horse and the way its ears had pinned back to say, "Enough." Gideon stepped forward and slapped the animal's shoulder with an open palm that meant stop in any language a horse spoke. The gelding backed, the rider's shot went wild, and sparks lifted from the old ash in complaint. "Go," Mercy said to Sam without looking at him. "Get Sheriff Kells. Now!" Sam ran like a boy who'd finally been given permission to turn fear into speed. The third rider wheeled to follow and cut him off. Gideon put his body where the boy had been, letting the horse shoulder to his braced hip. The rider leaned low to rake Gideon with his stirrup. Gideon caught leather with the tongs and wrenched with the kind of technique that made a man with two hands look like he'd brought the wrong number to the fight. The rider hit dirt and his breath left as a surprised animal noise. The night didn't explode, it tightened. Sometimes violence is not a storm but a rope pulled taut until even silence hums. Mercy felt the hum under her feet. The ledger in her bag was a small, unforgiving heartbeat. Her mind counted. 3 riders, 1 wounded pride, 1 empty hat, 1 Colt with fewer rounds each breath. "You ain't to scare," the hatless one panted, wiping blood from the nick Mercy had carved along his ear. "Now I'm obliged to educate." "Don't educate with your mouth. It costs you teeth." He snarled and came out of the saddle half, pistol up. Mercy didn't try to be faster than the idea of him. She looked for the solid part, the set of his shoulders, the lean of his weight, the little hesitation that says a man believes himself invincible. She shot that belief where it lived. The bullet took his gun hand high. The pistol flew. He yelled and stumbled. "Enough," a fourth voice said from the cottonwood's deeper shadow, and Mercy tasted the word like copper. She had not counted 4. The voice belonged to a man who never raised it and found he didn't need to. "You were told polite. Polite left when you threw fire," Mercy said, and she heard with a detached sort of calm how her voice had calcified into something even Briggs would have to cut, not push. The fourth man eased his horse into starlight. Not Briggs, but a man who wore Briggs's permission like a second skin. His hat had a neat crease. His mustache looked combed by the same hand that counted money. He surveyed the ash, the half-house, the swinging door, Gideon's stance, Mercy's Colt. His eyes ticked once at the cottonwood, once at the creek's dark line. "Mr. Briggs regrets the necessity," he said. "Mr. Briggs ought to meet necessity before he regrets it," Gideon said. The neat man's gaze slid to Gideon's pinned sleeve and held for half a beat too long. "You fix hinges," he said. "Stay a hinge and don't pretend to be a lock." "Say your name," Mercy said. Names are leverage in a town where men try so hard to be machines. He considered whether it cost him anything. "Dale Harkness," he said. He tipped his hat in a motion meant to pass for civility. "Mr. Briggs's foreman." "Foreman," Mercy repeated, as if she were making room for the word on a shelf. "You came to take me." "To invite you to a conversation," Harkness corrected. "On the south porch. There's shade and a view of the creek you're wrong about." His eyes turned friendly with effort. "We'll see what papers mean when men talk." "My papers will speak in the courthouse. My feet will stand on my ground." Harkness sighed. "This county eats tender ones," he said, not unkindly. He gestured. "We're leaving. You're marked in any case." He let the statement sit like a tack in a chair. "Tomorrow's weather will be interesting." He kneed his horse lightly. The riders gathered themselves with the offended dignity of men who had expected a moderate triumph and received a lesson. The hatless one,
retrieved his hat from the ash, wincing when his fingers found the bullet's work, and glared at Mercy as if she had introduced him to an unpleasant truth and not saved his life by aiming where she had. They turned their horses south. Hoofbeats receded along the road hard as a judge's knuckles on a table. Silence tried to rush in, panicked by what it had heard. Mercy stood still and let it settle. The door swung inward a little, then clicked back against its latch, as if to prove itself. Mikas hissed out a breath. "You shot the pistol out his hand," he said reverently, accent bending the syllables until they sounded like praise and physics at once. "I shot at what I could manage," Mercy said. Her heart slowed into something like a rhythm again. The ledger weighed steady in her bag. The strongbox key pressed the bone of her hip. "The sheriff will come?" "Sam has legs," Gideon said. He wasn't looking at the road. He watched the creek. Night made it blacker than it was, as if depth could be painted. Harkness isn't a man to waste the last words of a night. Interesting means he put his thumb somewhere. "On the mayor?" Mercy asked. "On the dam upstream. Red Mesa's low gate." Mercy measured that. "He'd flood us," she said. The idea felt unreal until she pictured it in particulars. The door she loved so quickly shouldered off its hinges, boards carried like drift prayers, the ledger drowned into pulp if she carried it wrong. Why? Because water carries blame away with it. A flood is an act of God. A match is a man you can name. His mouth compressed. Briggs likes to be the only man named. They didn't sleep. They banked the field hearth to save coals and set lanterns at the corners of the new frame so a rise in water would show itself as movement where there should be none. Mercy put rope and canvas where they could be reached in a blind grab. Mikas and Gideon strung a bell on wire, a thin, foolish thing that would ring either to save them or to sing their last notice. Sheriff Kells arrived with 2 men from the North Ridge and a lamp that bounced on the trot. Sam slid off his horse and bent double, hands on knees, the posture of a boy who had turned distance into a proof he'd remember. He wheezed. 4. Foreman Harkness, 2 others, a hat. Kells took it in with a glance that counted facts instead of blood. "Any dead?"
"No," Mercy said. "Only choices." She held up the notice Briggs had nailed to the tree and the order Kells had given her. "I have paper the size of the problem and smaller." Kells read both, sighed, and passed the notice to one of his riders to deliver back to the mayor's door like a wet fish. "We hold your ground by standing on it," he said. "If Harkness flooded you, he'd drown a fence line and 2 of Briggs's lower pastures. He doesn't like to pay for his lessons. But I have seen him decide a loss is cheap if it buys a bigger win." He looked at Gideon. "You think they'll try the low gate?" "If I were a man who liked witnesses," Gideon said, "I'd wait for Sunday. If I were a man who was in a hurry to teach Mercy what water owns, I'd try before dawn." "Then we put eyes on the bend," Kells said. He posted one of his men at the cottonwood with a lantern, shielded by a hat. He sent Sam up the ridge with a cowbell and the instruction to ring it if the creek rose like a drunk. He pressed his lips flat at Mercy's Colt and didn't tell her to put it away. "You've got aim," he said simply. "You also have men who'll stand between you and what you shouldn't have to shoot." Mercy wanted to say she would never ask that, but asking had nothing to do with the things that happen. "Thank you," she said, which covered many debts. They kept watch as the night thinned. The creek made its low, tireless talk. A chill found Mercy's wrists and wouldn't be brushed off. She thought of the ledger like a live coal and wondered whether truth could burn cleaner than lies. Dawn arrived with a pale conscience and then brightened into the kind of morning people later call innocent. The creek kept to its banks. The bell on wire didn't ring. Sam fell asleep on his feet like a horse and woke embarrassed and proud both. Kells sent his men to their work and promised to return with 2 more by noon. "If Briggs means to climb this fence," he said, "he'll come with a claim paper to wrap around the wire. Harkness writes neat."
Hollow Rock awoke to the news at its own pace, a ripple from the bank to the boarding house to the forge to the saloon, where even men who didn't believe in anything believed in a good story. Mrs. Peabody arrived with bread and a kettle and set both down in a way that made argument a sin. "You'll eat while you wait," she said to Mercy. "A woman who rebuilds on coffee alone will think her thoughts too fast and say them out loud in the wrong order." Micus grinned and snuck a heel of bread like a boy who'd earned his theft. Gideon drank coffee from a tin cup and didn't flinch when it burned. Mercy wrapped her hands around her own cup and let her ribs find a slow rhythm again. Harkness came at 10, with a paper in a folded leather case and an expression that had been polished to pass for reason. He dismounted as if his horse were a chair at a desk. "Miss Calloway, Mr. Rook, Sheriff." He held the case out toward Kells. "An injunction by the mayor's office, pending clarification of title and water rights, for the common good." Kells didn't take it. He said, "I'm the law that can read," not loudly. "Let me see." He read. His mouth went as flat as an anvil. "You set your name to this, Dale?" "I did not," Harkness said pleasantly. "I am only a courier of unfortunate necessity." "And the mayor?" Kells asked. "His signature is conveniently legible," Harkness said. "He has the kind of hand that would like to be remembered." "You tell the mayor the law doesn't stop at ink," Kells said. He folded the injunction and put it in his pocket as if it came to him by right. "You tell him the recorder stamped her end and I stamped mine, and a man's house isn't neglect because it made ash. You tell him I'll see him on the courthouse steps with every woman who's ever boiled his laundry standing behind me." Harkness's smile cooled. "Sheriff," he said, "you've got barns and a mortgage. Your temper is an asset you can't afford to spend." Kells met his eyes and let a lifetime of small debts parade through without shame. "You seeing my ledger?" "I see everyone's ledgers," Harkness said almost wistfully. "That's my job." He turned to Mercy. "We can be graceful about this. Pack your things. We'll escort you to town. Mr. Briggs will see you properly compensated for inconvenience." Mercy felt the ledger in her bag. She thought of the line about compensation due on vacancy, and her jaw clicked before she could stop it. "The creek is not inconvenience. It is life." "Life," Harkness agreed. "And property, and the growth of a county. Big men like big things, Miss Calloway. Little creeks make small harvests." He looked at Gideon's pinned sleeve again and let a shade of pity shape his mouth. "I was raised to respect handicaps."
Gideon's voice was soft. "We weren't raised together." Harkness glanced at the door and the frame and the hinge plates bright with new bevel where Gideon had planed them to fit. He judged and filed the judgment somewhere he could reach it later. "No flood, then," he said, "for now." He put 2 fingers to his hat brim. "Good morning." They watched him go, not because they hoped he'd turn back, but because men like that are less dangerous when you keep their spine in sight. Kells took out the injunction and folded it again along a new crease that would make the mayor's desk think. "You go into the recorder?" he asked Mercy. "Yes," Mercy said, "with my words, with witnesses, with proof." She stopped herself there. The ledger was a weight that meant she had to choose each second which direction to lean. Gideon read the thought she didn't say. "Bring a copy," he said. "Of a ledger?" Mercy asked. "Of what matters," Gideon said. "We can't copy all the sums and the sins by noon, but we can take pictures with words a town won't forget." Mrs. Peabody set her hands on her apron. "You'll use my parlor table and my best pen," she said, "and I'll invite the quilting circle, which has more eyes than the bank vault and a better memory." She fixed Kells with a look. "You'll send the recorder herself if you want cakes at the next church social." Kells managed not to smile. "The recorder's on her way."
he said. "I sent Milt." The parlor smelled like clean starch, bread, and a judgment that had been saved for Sunday and spent today. Mercy laid the ledger on the table as if it were a body that required respect even if it had been wicked. She lifted the canvas, the worn binding, the ribbon. Mrs. Peabody drew the curtains just so to keep the sun from turning ink brittle before it dried. Women gathered, quiet, quick, merciless in their kindness. Gideon stood in the doorway like a door that had learned how to think. Mercy opened the ledger to the page that named the mayor. She wrote with the parlor's best pen and a hand that had trained itself to be neat as survival, the bones of the entry: date, sum, recipient, the word facilitation. She wrote the line that made the back of her neck cold: Talbot Fire, compensation due upon vacancy. She spoke each word as she wrote it, so that it lived in more than paper. Women repeated phrases in low voices, letting the syllables find purchase in the room's corners. Recorder Ames arrived with her spectacles and her stamp and a cake, because one must not break a habit if one can help it. She read the ledger where Mercy's finger pointed and pressed her lips together as if to keep her temper from leaking. She said, "We will need this before the territorial judge, but we will start where we are." She looked at the women. "You saw. You heard. If you are asked, you will say what you saw, and you will not blanch when a man throws dust at your feet." Mrs. Peabody sniffed. "I haven't blanched at a man since the war, and then only because he'd been dead a week when they brought him in." "Then we are strong enough," Ames said simply. They wrote until the ink took a nap in the nib. They listed names and lines. They turned the ledger's weight into a sheet thin enough to carry to the courthouse steps and thick enough to serve bread on if bread ran short. Then Mercy closed the ledger, wrapped it again, and set it in her bag against her body. The copies, Mrs. Peabody's careful hand, and two more from women who had taught school before marriage and men and money taught them other lessons, went into Recorder Ames' folio. Ames slid her stamp over each page's corner, not to make it official, but to make anyone who snatched it have to answer for interrupting her work. They took it to the steps. The mayor had been warned, because men in neat hats have cousins who live at cross streets. He waited, with a smile and a hand that fluttered like a napkin, at a table no one else had been invited to. Ransom Briggs stood off to the side, not quite in shadow, because men like him pretend not to need it. Harkness stood half a step behind him, the way a conscience would if it had the wrong job. People came. News had a way of choosing the fastest horse in a town. Men who'd never held a ledger before craned to see one from 5 feet away. Women who had held books their whole lives held silence hard enough to make room for every word Mercy chose. Recorder Ames spoke first. She was not a preacher, but her voice wore Sunday with comfort. She said, "We have pages, we have sums, we have dates, we have your names in ink that won't wash off in a speech." She held up a copy. "This is the ledger of Red Mesa Land and Water Company, found in the hearth of the Talbot place after fire ate what it could and left what it couldn't digest. We will not accuse without saying why. We will not whisper. We will read." She read until the crowd stopped breathing like a crowd and started breathing like a verdict. The line about the mayor's facilitation made some men look at their shoes and others look at their wives. The line about the Talbot fire pulled the day's light thinner. A baby cried once and then settled, as if someone had reminded it the world still held milk. The mayor lifted his chin. "This is slander," he said. "I serve the common good. I serve growth. Progress requires grease."
"Grease doesn't start fires," Mrs. Peabody said. The crowd laughed, Not because it was funny, but because laughter was the only refusal some men understood. Briggs stepped forward politely, like a man who would offer condolences at a funeral. "You're riling up decent folk with bookkeeping errors," he said. "Country folk don't read columns right. They put their thumb on the wrong side of the sum." Mercy felt the moment arrive like a bird landing on a line. She stepped up beside Recorder Ames. She didn't raise her voice, because the town would raise its ears if the thing being spoken was worth it. "I can read," she said. "I have read my whole life because words were food when food was thin. This ledger says you paid for ash." She looked at Briggs. "It says you bought what fire could not carry away." Briggs met her gaze without blinking. "It says someone tried to protect a creek from an unproven claim," he said. "A wives' fund. A kindness with math." "It says you think the county owes you its river," Mercy said. "It says you think terrible things are tidy on paper." The sheriff stood between them with the relaxed hands of a man who has his anger on a leash. "We won't settle this today," he said to the crowd. "We will settle that no cattle cross Miss Calloway's line while the law takes breath." He looked at the mayor. "We will settle that your injunctions go in my stove until a judge says otherwise." He looked at Briggs. "We will settle that floodgates stay closed unless God himself kicks them." Briggs smiled without opening his mouth. "Of course, we are all neighbors." He touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat and tipped it a fraction. "Miss Calloway." He walked away with Harkness behind him, and the crowd parted like wheat before a weather that pretended not to be wind. The town didn't cheer. It released the breath it had been holding and went back to the work it had to do when speeches stopped. That is how you know a place is still alive after it's been lied to. It keeps doing the small things with care. Gideon walked with Mercy as far as the edge of the square. He said nothing until the murmur had run off in every direction. "They won't try the flood in daylight. They've got pride to water first." "I have something I haven't told you," Mercy said. She felt the secret like a second, hidden breath. "I came with more than I look like." She told him in a low voice about the stitched hem, the packet of bearer coupons safer than they deserved to be, the bank drafts tucked where no inspector had put his hands because they thought a woman seemed unimportant. Gideon went quiet in a way that was not judgment. He walked 3 steps. "Mercy?" he said finally. Her name a weight he lifted carefully. "That is a fortune to the wrong man and a tool to the right one." "I've been both the wrong and the right person to myself. I need it to be a tool now." "What do you mean to buy?" "Time," she said. "Hands that don't ask questions. Grain and glass. A lawyer who files fast and isn't afraid to eat with women." She met his eye and didn't throw the next sentence against a wall to see if it stuck. "Your time, too, not as a guard, as a partner. I won't ask you to stand in front of bullets. I will ask you to stand in front of promises." Gideon exhaled through his nose, a sound that might have been a laugh in a gentler world. "I've never had a partner," he said. "I've had work. I've had an anvil that talks back and a town that tells me where it hurts." "I won't compete with your anvil. I'll bring you iron and a map." "Then I'll bring you heat and how to hold it." He stopped and looked at her straight. "We'll keep it quiet. The less the town thinks you can buy it, the more it will volunteer what it wants to be." They set to it like people who had learned it was better to decide than to be decided upon.
Mercy arranged in kitchen corners and back porches, the kind of hires that cost less because a woman asked and paid more because she kept her word. Glass for windows arrived on a wagon that had carried hymnals last week. A box of square nails came with a note from a rancher who had watched his wife listened on the courthouse steps and discovered he was not done surprising her.
Gideon made iron talk. He poured hinge leaves that lay flush against the doorframe like promises. He forged a bar for the door that a boy could lift fast and a strong man would struggle to break if surprised. He built a draw gate for the creek with mikas, a sluice box that didn't fight water so much as redirect its impatience. Mercy kept numbers like prayer beads. She spent coin like a woman counting versus a man boasting. She didn't touch the bearer coupons. Those were for a judge, a disaster, or the kind of opportunity that asked you to wager everything on a better word than the one you had. Kells moved men around the county like chess if chess had mud. He made a list on paper and a different one in his head. Who would stand when the first steer's hoof hit Mercy's new fence? Who would pretend to misunderstand the assignment and keep plowing? Who would blink in the dust and then nod and join? He brought 2 more orders to tack to the cottonwood, written in his slow hand so even a liar could copy it right when he tried to misquote it later. Briggs did nothing a man could point at and put cuffs on. That is a kind of doing a county learns to fear. He held Sunday as if piety could be borrowed when you needed it. He walked into the saloon as if the floor had been cut to his stride. He didn't go near the forge because honest heat makes some men itch. Harkness adjusted the mare like trim around a door that swells when it rains. He sent a wire. He sent another. He met a stranger at the depot whose hat didn't match his boots, and Mercy saw them from the recorder's window and felt the ledger warm against her hip. The house rose. A roof went on. It was not pretty in the way of a shined boot. It was beautiful in the way of a boot that knows the trail. The first pane of glass slid into its bed with a sound like a truth spoken and accepted. Mercy ran her fingers over the window frame and felt splinter and smooth and the ache in her knuckles she had come by honestly. "You'll sleep here tonight," Gideon said, as if saying it could fence the night. "Even if it's on boards, even if the wind complains." "I will," Mercy said. She wanted to add, "as long as the creek behaves," but she did not put that dare into the world. Evening pulled the valley closer. Mrs. Peabody left quilts and the kind of stew that tastes like more than itself. Mikas fell asleep in the doorway with his back against the new jam and his mouth open like a boy who trusted a threshold to stand watch while he rested. Sam snored once and pretended he hadn't. Gideon raked the field hearth into something that would glow and not boast about it. Mercy stood at the door and watched the creek reflect a sky trying on stars. She let her mind take the measure of the day and then release it, like cloth eased off a tailor's chalk. She thought of Owen's last letter, its confession and courage. She thought of the ledger, its rot and its utility. She thought of Gideon's right hand, sure, his left sleeve empty. The way emptiness had taught him to fill the world differently. She thought of the word partner and didn't apologize to herself for liking it. Wind shifted. Somewhere far up canyon, a low sound rolled over the stones. Mercy had grown up with trains and their iron sermons. This was not that. This was a murmur the earth made to water when something big moved it. Gideon's head came up like a deer's. His body learned a sound before his mind named it. "Hear that?" "Yes," Mercy said. The low tone swelled. It wasn't a bell. It wasn't thunder. It was a filled pocket being turned out all at once. Sam on the ridge with the cowbell rang it so hard the clapper hit like a fist. The note cut the air in ragged strips. Mikas woke like a man dumped in a river and scrambled to the creek bank to read shadows. Kells burst from the cottonwood as if he'd been grown in its trunk. "Gate!" he shouted. "Upstream!" Gideon didn't run. He moved at the exact speed a man does who has to turn time into shape. "Sandbags," he said. "Boards, rope." He pointed once and people became answers. "Bar the door." He looked at Mercy without letting fear move his mouth. "Put the ledger in the cellar we just cut, not to save paper, to save what it does to a room."
Mercy ran inside and lifted the trap they'd chiseled out of stubborn earth that afternoon. It wasn't a cellar yet so much as a hole with a promise, but it was dry and deeper than a thief's first grab. She slid the ledger into the space under the step where her hand would find it blind. She kissed her fingers, a habit learned from women who blessed bread and babies, and touched the canvas once. She came up into a night that had grown a different voice. Water talks when it is coming fast. It tells you how far it means to go. The creek had a white seam on its lip that had not been there a minute ago. It was the grin of something ready to bite. They worked like people who had practiced for a disaster even when they hadn't. Sandbags became a line. Boards became a shallow wall. Rope became a way to keep boys on one side and men with more experience on the other. Mrs. Peabody arrived with 6 women and a 7th who'd never lifted anything heavier than a hymn book, and lifted sand anyway.
Kells set men where their feet would get them out if a cow came down like a log. Tie yourself to the fence post if you fancy living, he said. Untie yourself if the water decides to take the post. He looked at Gideon. You can't hold this with one arm. Gideon bared his teeth in something like a smile. Watch me hold it with my back. He braced himself against the post, set his boots like Anchor's cousins, and took a rope around his shoulder like a harness that had chosen the right animal. The first wave reached their feet and then their knees. It wasn't a wall yet. It was a low betrayal, water stepping where it hadn't asked permission. The second came with sticks and a fence rail from somebody's line upstream. The third brought a calf bawling. Sam went white and reached. Kells yanked him back, because a boy's strength is not meant to test a river. The calf hit the rope, spun, rolled away, found a shallow, and staggered out with a look of surprise cows share with men when the world doesn't kill them on its first try. Bell, Kells bellowed. Sam rang it until his hands blistered. Bells don't stop water. They tell people how to breathe. Harkness appeared on the south bank with 2 men and a lantern held high in a way that made its light smug. He cupped his hands. Accident, he called, doing the courtesy of a lie everyone could all see. Gate stuck. We're working at it. Work faster, Gideon called back, and the river ate the words like lettuce. Mercy felt fear move in her chest like a big animal in a small pen. She named each breath and sent it out to work. She tied a fresh rope to the new door's bar and looped it to the cottonwood. If the hinge goes, you will not. She spoke to things because they had stood by her when people hadn't. The water climbed. It came to the boards and shouldered them, and then, because boards are stubborn in a way water respects, slid around and tried another way. Mikas slipped and yelped and found his feet and laughed once like a martyr and a child at the same time. Gideon grunted and held, and the rope bit his shoulder through his shirt, leaving a line that would bruise into a memory of geometry. Briggs rode down with 5 men and watched with the cool detachment of a man enjoying a show he had produced. He pointed once, and his men laughed. Harkness didn't laugh. He watched the gate upstream and sent a man with the lantern to flash a code that meant either fix or finish. Mercy didn't know which. Another foot, Kells said, voice hoarse. If it takes another foot, we fall back to the second line. Mercy looked at the line and then at the house. The ledger lay under the step like a sleeping snake. The roof they had bullied into shape today made a complete thing in the dark that meant home even to a woman who had trained herself not to be sentimental about boards. She thought of Owen, of his careful hand, and the cowardice he had named and refused. She felt something rise in her that wasn't rage exactly, and wasn't just resolve. It was a mothering that had nothing to do with babies and everything to do with keeping what you promised a place. Gideon, she said, let me take the rope. No, he said. The word was plain. A rope takes more than a hand. Then hold the rope, and I'll hold you." And before pride could argue, she stepped behind him and pressed her shoulder into his back, wrapped her arms around his ribs, and turned her body into a second post. He snorted a laugh that made the rope vibrate. "You weigh less than a fence," he said, but he leaned into her anyway, and the strength they made together was not masculine or feminine, but human. The water hit the sandbag line with the offended vigor of something told no and hurled itself higher. The bags held. The line bowed. It did not break. Harkness's men shouted upstream. The lantern flashed again with the desperate grammar of men who had found the lever but not the will. A log, a real one, stripped by spring runoff and stored in some ravine like a knife in a drawer, rode the water straight for the door. Sam screamed a warning. Mikas threw himself at the door to kick the latch home. The log hit the frame. The hinge plates Gideon had overbuilt because he didn't trust weather or men screamed once like an animal and then went silent because they held. Briggs swore. It was the first time the night had made him say a word he didn't get to practice. He turned his horse and rode hard south because some men prefer not to be present when their plans misbehave in public. Harkness stayed, and the careful shape of his face cracked at the edges with something like respect and something like fury.
The water began to drop. Not fast, not dramatically, but the white seam lost its teeth. The board stopped shuddering like a door with a secret behind it. The rope bit less cruelly. The bell went from frantic to stubborn, and then to embarrassed, and then to quiet. They stood there for a long minute, because bodies don't know when to let go until someone tells them. Kells told his by sitting down where he stood. Gideon told his by letting the rope slide to his elbow. Mercy told hers by resting her forehead against Gideon's back for one beat longer than necessity. The creek told everyone's by shrugging and going back to talking to stones. Neighbors appeared in the damp that followed disaster the way they always do, with towels, with jokes made softly, with opinions held until morning. Mrs. Peabody cried once, silently, and then complained about the mud as if it had wronged her personally. Mikas laughed like a man who was relieved to have something to laugh at again. Sam pretended very hard not to be shaking. Kells wiped his face with his hat and grimaced at the grit that transferred. "That gate didn't stick," he said. "It jerked and paused, like a man holding a door for a friend and then letting a stranger through." "I know the sound of a stuck hinge," Gideon said. "I heard permission." Mercy leaned against the door and felt the hinge plates with the back of her hand, the way you check a fever. Warm, but not ruins. She let herself smile and then tuck it away fast. "We sleep in the house tonight," she said, because saying it made it a kind of sacrament. They did. They bedded on quilts on the new floor and woke 3 times when a night noise tried to sell itself as tragedy. Each time the rope on the door hummed once, a lullaby played on iron. Each time Mercy's hand found the ledger under the step by instinct and left it there by choice. Morning brought mud and the peculiar energy disaster leaves behind, a surge of competence that feels like grief with a job. Gideon's shoulder was a map of rope. Mercy tied salve into the hurt without asking permission. He didn't complain. Men who use tools learn not to speak ill of a pain that taught them how to listen. Briggs sent a man with a note. Harkness didn't sign it. The mayor didn't either. The paper smelled like cigar and pretend. "You have made a mistake," it read. "You have embarrassed decent men. Correct it. Present yourself at my south porch at noon for terms. R.B." Mercy held the note over the field hearth's small flame and let it char politely before it curled. "I will present myself on the courthouse steps at noon, with witnesses and a judge's clerk." She looked at Kells. "Can you get the clerk?" "Easier than getting a judge," Kells said. "Clerks like to be useful. Judges like to be right." "And the judge?" Mercy asked. "Circuit comes through tomorrow, if the tracks don't wash. Harkness will try to make them wash, but the judge likes pie, Mrs. Peabody's pie.
He looked at Mrs. Peabody, who crossed her arms as if she'd just been asked to save a life with lard and flour again. "We'll get our judge." Mercy spent the morning the way a general spends the night before a battle, not sleeping, not pacing, not speechifying, but setting out water, checking buckles, counting the people she could trust by first name and the ones she would not test past a handshake. She moved money that didn't look like money, flour to a house where the man was proud, nails to a house where the woman would hand them back doubled a week later in pie. She gave Mika's $2 with instructions to buy paper and run if anyone asked why. She gave Sam a job that had no danger in it and pretended it mattered more than it did until it did. At noon, Hollowbot gathered. Recorder Ames wore her stamp like a brooch. The mayor wore a fresh collar and a fear trying not to sweat. Briggs did not come. Harkness stood in his place with the look of a man who had told his employer to stay home because leverage works better when it isn't talking. Mercy stood on the top step. She felt the step feel her weight and take it like good wood. Yesterday, we read a ledger. Today, we stand on a house. Tomorrow, a judge will ask us if we are serious. She let her eyes touch faces, women who had held candles over births, and men who had dug graves with their own hands, and boys who had decided this was the afternoon they would learn what adults were. We are. Harkness raised his neat hand. "Miss Calloway, I am authorized to offer a settlement. Money for inconvenience, more money for silence. A place on higher ground with a well and no creek to argue over. You will live longer." Mercy thought of the stitched hem. She thought of how money sits quiet until it's taught to move. "I appreciate a good offer. I do not accept lies wrapped in coin." She lifted the copy of the ledger page in Recorder Ames' hand and said, "This says you arranged a fire and called it bookkeeping." She looked at the mayor. "This says you traded your office for paper." She turned to the town. "This says water is a man you can own. I say it is not." The crowd shifted in that way crowds do when they remember their names. Someone started to clap and stopped when it felt like church. Kells didn't look at Harkness when he said, "I will not arrest a woman for improving a burned place. I will arrest a man for crossing her fence." He looked at the mayor. "I will also arrest a mayor for selling an office." The mayor puffed. "You and what budget?" Kells smiled, and it was not nice. "Me and a judge who likes pie."
Harkness spread his hands. "Very well," he said softly, which is a phrase that means a gate just slid open somewhere you can't see. He took a step back into the line where his men stood with their hats correct and their hands still. "We will have our day." He tipped his head to Mercy. "Miss Calloway." He walked away as if leaving a room he had built. That night, Mercy slept in the house again because she refused to let the last hour of the day belong to men who wrote notices and wore tidy hats. She woke just before dawn with a sense of a curtain being raised. The creak sounded wrong. Not fast, not loud, just complicated. Gideon was already sitting up, boots in his hand, face turned toward the door like a compass finds north. "Do you hear that?" Mercy whispered. "Yes," Gideon said. "That's not a gate." "What is it?" "A cut," he said. "They made a channel above us in the night." She stood in the doorway in her stocking feet and watched the creek create a new mouth 20 yards uphill from where it had been told to talk all her life. Water chewed, seduced dirt into being a river, moved its shoulder against the bank with a confidence that came from a hand on a shovel somewhere in the dark. The new channel angled straight toward the corner of the house where the ledger slept. Sam rang the bell and then shouted, because bells are instruments and boys are trumpets. Kells ran as if he'd never done anything else and still had the knees for it. Mikas grabbed shovels and swore in 2 languages and invented a third. Mrs. Peabody arrived in her nightcap and didn't notice it until noon. Gideon didn't say a brave thing, he said a true one. "We don't have enough men." "I have enough money," Mercy said, and heard herself make a bet in public with the god of this county. She ran to the road, climbed on a barrel, and threw coin into her voice. $2 for any man who puts his shovel where my plans are, she shouted. 4 if we turn it by sunup, 6 if you bring a brother and keep your mouth shut about what a woman paid. Men came like iron filings to a magnet, not because of the money only, though money makes integrity sprint, because they had watched a door hold and a rope bite and a ledger walk into daylight and not burn up. They dug. Gideon set the angle. Kells placed bodies where they would do the least harm to themselves. Mercy hauled boards and sand and didn't pretend she could understand all of Gideon's geometry, only that her arms could be problem and solution both. The cut deepened and then hesitated. Water does not prefer to be told no twice in the same week. It gathered its patience into a new velocity. The first wave hit their quick dam and tried to climb it. It fell back and laughed and brought friends. "Braces!" Gideon shouted. Mikas braced, Kells braced with an enthusiasm that would break something he liked if no one watched. Mercy ran the rope from the cottonwood to the new brace and wrapped it twice and then a third time because her hands believed in belts and suspenders when the world sagged. For a minute the world held. For a second, it did not. The left brace kicked at the base where someone's boot had set it shallow and soft soil. The water took that mistake and used it like a hinge. The brace tilted. The dam sighed. Mercy saw the hinge line show itself like a smile on the wrong man. She didn't think. Thinking is a luxury when angles go bad. She threw her weight on the brace. It slowed. It did not stop. Gideon swore and put his back beside hers. Kells threw his rope over the top and hauled like an ox with a tax bill. The brace trembled. The water pressed its case with lawyerly persistence and the patience of gravity. "More," Gideon grunted through his teeth. "More weight." "We're out of men," Kells said. "We're out of time." He looked up the new channel toward the bend where the hillside narrowed into a throat. His face changed. "Get back," he roared. "All of you, get—" The shout broke as the hillside itself moved. Dirt slumped like a beast rolling over in its sleep. Upstream, just out of sight, something let go with a sound like a church turned over. The water rose in a single, unarguable surge, not gradually, but as if a door had opened inside the earth and emptied a room no one had known was there. The new channel became a black tongue. The old creek leapt to meet it as if brothers had found each other at war. The sound stacked on itself until it stopped being sound and became a presence, a wall with hands. The black sheet rounded the bend, carrying fence posts, a trough, the body of a goat, and the top half of a gate with Red Mesa stamp on it. It came straight for the corner of the house where the ledger lay, a straight line drawn by men who believed in rulers more than they believed in consequences. Mercy stood with her shoulders under the brace and felt the brace turn timid under her. She looked at Gideon. He looked at her. In his eyes she saw not apology, not fear, but the electric certainty of a decision neither could unmake. "Inside!" he shouted, and his voice had to climb over the river to reach her. "Get the ledger and get out!" She ran for the door as the wall of water reared higher than a roof, taller than a promise, full of other people's sins.
And stepped into the doorway as the wall of water reared, higher than a roof, taller than a promise, full of other people's sins. Mercy dropped into the house like a stone into its well. The new door caught behind her and shuddered hard against the bar, a bull at a red gate. The sound went through the boards and into her bones. She slid across the new floor on her knees, ripped up the trap they'd cut that afternoon, and reached for the ledger as if she were reaching for a sleeping heart. It was right where she'd left it, under the step, wrapped in canvas, warmed by the day and her worry. She pulled it free and hugged it to her chest, just as the window burst in a clatter of glass and a fist of water. The lantern went out in a hiss like a snake that had lost the argument. Night flooded in with the river. "Mercy!" Gideon's shout struck the door at the same moment the water did.
"I've got it!" she shouted back, and the room gave her voice back to her, shredded into pieces by the roar. The rope creaked. The hinge plate screamed once, a sound like iron refusing a lie, and held. The first wave spilled across the floor to her ankles, then knees, then waist. Cold took her breath, and then gave it back mean. She jammed the ledger inside her dress under the bodice, tight and high and out of the water's first greed. She clawed at the trap's edge to brace herself as the current slid for the door with anything it could persuade to go along. "Rope!" Gideon again, closer. She heard the twang and slap of it snaking under the door, felt it search in the dark until it found her thigh. She caught it, wrapped it around her wrist twice until it bit skin hard enough to write a reminder. "Pull!" she yelled. The rope hauled. She moved a foot, then an inch, then 3 when the retreating wave gave her back a piece of the house. Her skirt dragged like a drowned thing. She tore the hem without apology. Water took the broken pane and made it a mouth. Another wave shouldered in, lower but faster, carrying a chair, a plank, and a tin cup that had been Mrs. Peabody's favorite, whether she knew it or not. The ledger's corners bit her ribs. She thought, strangely clear, if I lose it, I still don't let go. The thought steadied her hands the way a needle steadies in a practiced seam. She tucked her chin, set her feet against the step, and let Gideon's pull become her own. Then he was at the door. Inside it, not outside it. She felt the cold shift and knew he'd come through like a man walking into an argument you promised you'd handle yourself. "Don't," she said automatically, and he answered like a smith answering heat. "Too late." He put his back to the door next to the bar, shoulder to wood, boots to floor, and made himself part of the hinge. The rope ran from the cottonwood, under the bar, around his shoulder, and to her wrist in a single line of stubborn geometry. He took half her weight and the door's insult, both. "Can you move?" "Yes," she lied, and then told the truth because she had trained herself into front of men who earned it. "Not without you." "Then not without me," he said. "Now." They moved, body by body, inch by inch. The ledger stayed high against her heart, an extra rib borrowed from a different animal. The water fell an inch, argued, rose back a half. The house groaned, complained, remembered it had been raised by hands that meant it to stand. Outside, men yelled in voices water couldn't keep. Sam's bell rang once like a joke and once like a prayer. Mika's shouted directly in Lithuanian at the creek and then apologized to God in English. Mercy reached the doorframe with a sound that embarrassed her and would have embarrassed any saint. Gideon's palm found the back of her skull the way men do when they forget to be careful because fear is bigger than privacy. He shoved her forward into the night and then came through beside her as the river took its deep breath for another try. She threw herself against the hinge post to keep from being thrown into the yard. The ledger slipped down under her bodice of fraction. She clotted back up like a woman fixing her dignity in a street fight. Gideon hooked the rope to a second spike he'd driven in the cottonwood this afternoon for no reason he could have named then, and the best reason now. "Hold!" he told the world. The world held. Not clean, not heroic, but sufficient. The wall of water shouldered the sandbags and the new brace, and then, as water does when it has to choose between pride and path, took the path around the cottonwood instead of through the door. It surged past them, snarled around the roots, tore out a patch of earth that had no politics, and lunged on toward the low ground like a drunk changing his mind about which fence to sit on.
The door exhaled. The hinge plates vibrated under Mercy's palm like a bell that had been struck and loved it. Gideon sagged only after the rope did, and then only to a knee, because a man with rope marks across his shoulder has earned his right to kneel on something other than a church's idea of penance. Kells was suddenly there, one hand on Gideon's good bicep, the other on Mercy's forearm. "Alive?" "Yes," Mercy said, which is also a kind of vow. And still in possession, she pressed a hand to her bodice and felt the ledger press back like proof. Harkness stood on the south bank, hat off now because night had punished manners out of him. He watched the water, the house, her, not with surprise. Men like him taught themselves not to be surprised, but with the dull, private irritation of someone whose tidy plan had picked up mud. "Accidents," he called again, voice hoarse. "So many accidents." "Name one, and God while you're at it."
He didn't answer. He turned his horse and rode toward the south ridge, where men who are paid in other men's money go to explain themselves in low voices. They did not sleep afterward. They did not sit down, because sitting is the argument a body loses right before it discovers more work. They walked the perimeter and prodded with sticks and found the weak parts while the world was still damp, as if the valley were a loaf that needed turning before it burned. They tightened the brace. They set the window opening with boards, ugly and necessary. They checked the door bar and kissed it with their palms without saying that that was what they were doing. When the dawn came, it looked offended and then ashamed, like a child earning forgiveness for a thing it had not done but had allowed. Hollow Rock woke slow. Word rolled along the street like a barrel someone had let loose. She held. The door, the cut, the gate, held. Mrs. Peabody arrived and cried openly this time because she had spent her ration of dryness. I brought coffee, she announced, to distract anyone with the manners to pretend they believed her. Then she looked at Mercy's soaked dress, at Gideon's rope-bit shoulder, at Kells's eyes, and glared at the creek as if it had opinions she refused to overhear. "Judge," Kells said, almost to himself, "today." "Pie," Mrs. Peabody answered, already marching away. By 10 the square was full, not a festival full, a barn-raising full, where people stand because standing is a kind of vote. Recorder Ames set her stamp on the top step again, and this time the ink pad was not necessary. The mark was in the faces. The circuit judge arrived with dust on his boots and truth in his belly because Mrs. Peabody had met the train at first light with a basket and a story and had not stopped talking until His Honor had, without recourse to dignity, eaten 2 slices before breakfast. He was a compact man with a gaze that weighed. He took in the new door, the scoured banks, the rope stripes on Gideon's shoulder showing through his torn shirt, the chisel marks on Mercy's palms, and the ledger under her arm. He nodded once, to no one visible. "Call it to order," he said. "We'll sit the law right here." It wasn't a trial properly, because procedure likes to dress itself before it matters. It was a hearing, but a hearing is where a town learns its own name. Kells spoke first, in a voice that had scraped its shin and learned to walk without favoring it. Recorder Ames read the affidavits. Mrs. Peabody spoke like a woman who had delivered and buried and fed the town into remembering it was human. Micus testified about the gate piece with the Red Mesa stamp. He produced it from where he'd pulled it out of a snag and brought it like a dog brings a bone that shouldn't be in the yard. Sam told the Bell story with embellishments that Recorder Ames trimmed down with a finger and a look until only the true parts remained, which were dramatic enough for any boy. Mercy stepped forward last. She did not have a speech. She had a nervous system that had learned to tell the truth because it slept better afterward. "My husband wrote me. He told me to come here. He hid a ledger because he understood how to be frightened and useful at the same time. Last night, men cut a new channel in the dark to wash this house away. The door held because a town decided it would. I asked the court to hold as well." She lifted the ledger, placed it on the step, and laid her hand on it like a Bible in a room that didn't always deserve one. "These are the sums. These are the names. This is how water was bought like a mule. Please make it belong to the creek again."
The judge opened the book. He read. He didn't move his mouth, but the whites of his knuckles signed a different document on the ledger's edges. He looked up. He found the mayor with his eyes. "Sir," he said gently, which hurt more than shouting, "you have written your office into the ledger of a private concern. Did you do this?" The mayor tried to smile and found that smile had been repossessed. Facilitation. Did you take money from Red Mesa Land and Water Company?" A pause that weighed as much as an answer. "Yes."
Did you authorize or fail to prevent the manipulation of a floodgate last night? Another pause. Another wait. No. It was the truth, which is not the same thing as innocence. The judge's eyes passed on. Harkness. The foreman stepped forward with his hat in his hand and his soul on a nail out of reach. Your Honor. Did your men cut a channel above the Talbot place? Harkness considered all the ways a lie could be dressed. None of the suits fit. Yes. On whose order? Harkness did a thing that made Mercy's chest ache. He glanced toward Briggs and then put his eyes back on the judge and kept them there. Mine, he said. Convenient, the judge said dryly. Did Mr. Briggs know of your plan? Harkness did not answer quickly enough for a man with nothing to hide. He knew the creek sometimes takes initiative, he said finally. He hoped the county would be spared further accidents. Ah, the judge said. He hoped. He turned to Kells. Arrest Mr. Harkness for criminal mischief to waterworks and conspiracy to deprive a homesteader of improvement. Kells moved. Harkness didn't argue. He offered his wrists with the dignity of a man who has been waiting for the sentence since he sat down to a meal he knew he couldn't digest. Arrest the mayor for malfeasance and bribery, the judge added without heat. We will find him alternative employment where signatures are not valued. The mayor protested then, as men do when they realize the room has decided without them. You can't, he began. I can, the judge said mildly. I am the law that has to keep sleeping in this county. He finally turned his head and gave Briggs the attention the rancher had been vibrating for. As for you, if you paid for any of this, the ledger will betray you more faithfully than any friend. If you did not, you have allowed men who answer to you to use your name like a pry bar. Either way, you will not place cattle on Miss Calloway's land. You will not approach her creek. You will not come nearer than the far fence until I say you can, and when I do, it will be to apologize or to be sentenced. Briggs laughed once, one syllable, no music in it. You speak fancy for a man who eats pie for jurisdiction. The judge's mouth twitched. And you confuse bluster for power. I have a marshal on the train behind me and a telegraph office that still takes my wire. Sit down, Mr. Briggs. Briggs sat, not out of obedience, out of calculation. The town watched a man do math with his pride. Now, the judge said, turning back to Mercy with a face that had put away thunder. Miss Calloway, you filed your deed. Yes, Your Honor. Recorder Ames? Stamped and noted. Then this is a home. The water rights predate Mr. Briggs's temper. The creek is yours to the measure of the law. The county will supervise restoration to the original channel. Sheriff Kells will appoint a water board consisting of men and women whose hands currently smell of mud. He smiled at Mrs. Peabody. Pie will be provided as necessary to speed deliberations. A ripple went through the crowd. Relief, like rain after smoke. Not a cheer. Cheering is for things that don't change the price of flour. This changed it. They breathed out and then in because now there was work. Your Honor, Mercy said softly, one more matter. She reached into the bodice and drew out the ledger's ribbon, blue, damp, indelible, held up for the town to see. I came with more coin than I look like. I will pay for the work to put the creek back where God left it. I will not ask the county for what men with money owe it by right, but, she let the word land, I will ask the court to require Red Mesa to pay double in penalties, and for that to go to the schoolhouse, the bridge fund, and to any family drowned in anybody's ledger. The judge's eyes softened. Granted, he said. Motion by a woman who knows how money works when it behaves. Entered into the record by a man who knows what happens when it doesn't. He banged the step with his palm as if it were a gavel,
and then began giving orders with the unshowy relief of someone who had been given a complicated thing to do and could do it in daylight. It didn't finish that day. Nothing honest does, but the center held. Cal sent deputies with Harkness and the mayor. The telegraph office clicked like a cricket with good news no one trusted yet. Briggs stood in the sun and let it look at him like it belonged to bigger things.
The town dispersed, not because they were bored, but because truth is hungrier than curiosity, and dinner was waiting. Mercy stood at the bottom of the courthouse steps with the ledger under her arm and felt the weight shift from evidence to history. She handed it to Recorder Ames, who held it the way a woman holds a sleeping child that belongs to a friend. "You keep the copy," Ames said, "and the copy of the copy. I'll sleep with this under my bed." Mercy laughed, a sound that startled her into believing she could still do it. "Don't let it teach the dust bad habits," she said. Gideon was beside her without announcing it. He looked thinner somehow, though he had eaten what Mrs. Peabody had put in his hand between orders. His sleeve was torn where the rope had taken a bite out of fabric and pride. The bruise already clouding his shoulder looked like a map drawn by someone who loved rivers too much. "You held," he said. "We held," she corrected. She let the "we" linger like a finger on a glass. He nodded once, humbly and absolutely. "We," he agreed. The house needed a day of mending and a week of drying and a lifetime of tending, which is what any good life asks. The creek slid back into the channel it had been given before men put their hands on it and decided to teach it grammar. The cut they had clawed open above the bend filled in with men and shovels and curses and the kind of laughter that makes other work easier. The cottonwood shook itself and decided to keep living, the way trees choose to because they cannot think of a better idea. Harkness's men testified again, this time with relief. Fitch at the bank developed a conscience in the night, expensive, late, sincere enough to matter, and produced a duplicate key to a safe deposit box Briggs had opened in the name of a cousin whose hands never touched dirt. Inside lay papers that thought they could wipe themselves clean by changing names. Recorder Ames taught them that ink is loyal to its first sin. The judge wired Santa Fe. Santa Fe wired back with the sound of a door shutting. 2 nights after the hearing, the town gathered for something that wasn't exactly a celebration because grief still had seats reserved at the table, but was not exactly not one. Lamps swung between cottonwood and porch. Fiddle learned a tune that wasn't a lie. Children ran in loops that matched the rope scars on the posts. Someone produced a sign painted on a board salvaged from somebody's barn, Talbot Calloway. Somebody else crossed out the hyphen with a grin and painted House. Mercy stood by the door and let people touch the hinge as they came in because it had become a relic in a town that needed one. She hugged Mrs. Peabody longer than either of them admitted to needing. She pressed a kiss to Sam's hair and pretended it had been an accident. She held Mikas's calloused hand between hers and said 2 words in his language that meant thank you and were wrong enough to make him laugh and right enough to make his eyes wet. Gideon approached the cottonwood with a small box in his hand. He set it on the step. "Payment," he said when she raised an eyebrow. "I didn't send you an invoice," she said, smiling. "You sent me a town that remembers my name," he said, and the seriousness in it turned the joke the right way up. "Open it." She did. Inside lay a ring, iron, not gold, thin as a promise and hammered with a pattern she recognized, the minute, rippling texture he made when he struck metal with the flat face of his hammer in quick succession, like rain over standing water. It glowed black where oil had kissed it and silver where light snuck in. "It's a hinge leaf," he said, almost shy. "From the first one we hung. I split it, rounded it. I thought a woman ought to choose what joins her to the world." She held the ring in her palm and let it warm to her. She did not put it on at once. She lifted it to her lip and touched it there the way women did rings in churches back east, and then she looked up at him and smiled like a bell ringing inside her chest.
I choose this, and I choose you at my door in the morning, and I choose not to write any word on paper that starts with wife and ends with property."
He nodded, a man who made things for a living and understood the necessity of clear measurements. "We can be both," he said. "Persons, partners." He hesitated and then finished the sentence like a nail driven true. "And married, if you will." Mercy felt her throat open in relief that tasted like bread. "I will," she said, "on one condition." "What's that?" "That we hang another hinge tomorrow," she said, "for a gate any child can swing." They did. It wasn't a wedding, not then. It was a morning of work. But in the work was the vow. They set posts on the far bank where the ground held. They strung a small footbridge over a narrow run. Gideon's notion, Mercy's insistence. Mikas brought a plank he had carved with his knife during every quiet minute the past week, which had not totaled to many. Mrs. Peabody arrived with paint the color of sunrise and a brush that had seen better days and chose to have another. Sam painted letters under Mercy's hand so he could say he'd written a word that mattered. The plank took it. When it dried, the letters read, "Second chances." Children crossed first. They do when people let them. The bridge bowed and did not complain. Mercy stood with her palm on the hinge plate and thought, doors, bridges, books, rings. All the same work, all the same ache, all the same joy. 2 weeks later, the judge married them under the cottonwood, with half the town as witnesses and the other half peeking from behind things. The vows were short because long vows are for people who haven't done any of the work yet. The ring slid on her finger and felt like an answer to a question she had not known how to ask when she boarded a train months ago. Gideon's eyes held hers and didn't let go when the fiddle started, and Mercy realized that she had arrived not at the end of a story, but at the place where you planned the next chapter with a pencil sharpened by what you survived. Ransom Briggs left town for a while, without leaving the county. That is a thing men do when they mean to return with new definitions. He sold 2 prime bulls to cover legal misunderstandings, as men like him say when they mean court. He stopped tipping his hat and started measuring his words, which is what a man does when he has been weighed and discovered the scale lives next door. Dale Harkness pled to not being able to sleep with himself anymore. The judge gave him a sentence that included building a public sluice for the schoolhouse garden and speaking to boys on Saturdays about the difference between doing a job and deciding who you are. He did both with his sleeves rolled up. He didn't say sorry the way men do to make the air easier to breathe. He just worked. People let him. The mayor resigned. Recorder Ames refused the office and recommended a woman who had never expected to be asked and had the sense to say yes after she counted childcare. The council voted for a water board with more aprons than vests on it. The creek ran the way creeks do when they have been argued with and then told they were right to begin with a little extra pride in its own stones. On an evening when the light lay down across the valley like a quilt, Mercy and Gideon sat on the step with their shoulders touching in that way that says more than hands get around to. The door stood open because the air had nothing in it that needed keeping out. The house smelled of pine and iron and stew, and the ghost of smoke turned into a warning everyone had decided to heed. Mercy slid her fingers along the grain of the step. She said, "When I left, I thought I was traveling to a man and an address." She smiled. "I stood in ash and found both. But I also found a town, a ledger, a door, and a creek that has a temper and a memory." She lifted her hand and looked at the ring, which had learned the shape of her finger like a good tool learns its user. "I found a hinge that fit." Gideon considered the valley with the tenderness of a man who had spent his life learning how to look at things so they would keep telling the truth. "People will forget the ledger someday. They'll remember the door." "They'll remember you," she said. "They'll remember you," he countered, and there was no gallantry in it, only record-keeping. The way you read, the way you stood when water lied. Mercy thought of the girl who stitched money into a hem and slept on trains while men measured and judged. She thought of the woman who signed a deed with a hand that didn't shake because shaking is for after, and she had too few afters left to spend. She let herself feel pride because shame had been given too many rooms in her earlier life. Tomorrow, we'll hang shutters. Tomorrow, he said, we'll teach Sam to set a hinge himself. And the day after, he said, and leaned his shoulder into hers so she could feel the smile that hid in his voice, we'll rest, which is work we owe ourselves. They watched the last of the light take a slow sip of the creek and then go where light goes. The door swung just a little in the evening breeze and clicked back against its latch. In the house behind them, the ledger lay on a shelf between a Bible and a jar of buttons resolute enough to survive fire. It had become not a weapon, not an idol, but a story with arithmetic that children would someday roll their eyes at and then ask questions about when they thought no one was looking. The cottonwood breathed. The bridge yawned and settled its weight. The creek talked to stones in a language Mercy had begun to hear. A stage rattled along the far ridge on its way to somewhere that needed mail and courage. The driver tipped his hat when he saw the house with the new roof and the door that had learned the shape of the wind. People on the coach looked down and made a small noise that happens in the chest when you see a thing that looks like an answer and you'd almost forgotten you were allowed to have one. Mercy stood. "Come inside," she said, "to the evening, to the world, to herself. We've got work in the morning." And the door, polite and proud, let her pass. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.